Okay, so we're certainly at a little bit of a crossroads here in the industry, and thanks for staying the whole day. I think there's a few people talking to Vinny in the corridors, but everybody sort of like had a breakless, breathless day of content. So congratulate yourselves for making it through the first day of CoinAgenda. So I'm going to start with just sort of having everybody give a little bit of their background and sort of the opinion sort of that I'll start out with is, you know, will the SEC make up its mind one way or the other in the next 12 months? I'll start with Joe.
Joe Cutler, partner at Perkins Coie. I am one of the co-founders of the blockchain group there, and we've been doing that since about 2013.
There meaning, oh, I'm sorry, at Perkins, not at the SEC blockchain group.
Right.
Okay, yep.
And you know, we've handled a lot of different token sales, and your question about whether we'll see the SEC make up its mind in the next 12
meaning
months.
Either a no action letter or at least having proposed regulations.
So I think that we'll probably see two things. I do think there are no action proceedings in process. I think that's well underway, and we are hopeful that we'll see that maybe even by the end of the year.
Wow.
So it's just a matter of whether they wind their way through properly. I mean, no promises on that, but right, that's the hope. And you know, you really have three choices, right? You can either do the no action process, you can do proposed rulemaking, or you can propose new legislation. New legislation, in my opinion, is off the table. That's not going to happen. Rulemaking, I think, is in the cards, but there are people, I mean, that's a year-long process minimum once it starts. And I don't think people are really clear yet what they want, let alone, and so the time to do rulemaking is when there's at least a consensus among most people as to what they want the outcome to be. The last thing you want to do is start rulemaking in a fictitious environment where everyone in the comment period, there's just trade of a bunch of comments back and forth that leaves the commission without a real consensus. And they want to be making small judgment calls where there's general consensus, but they're tweaking around the edges. They don't want a full-on war in the rulemaking process, and I think we're premature for that.
And so I guess the no action letter is sort of like the easiest one to get. And as I recall, there was a no action letter well before the Jobs Act in terms of saying this is sort of like something that we won't take action if this happens.
Yeah, I mean, so far they haven't really issued any hints either way. You know, they have opened up an email address where you can go in and talk to them. You know, and they're very curious about how this works, and they're very welcoming, which is sort of new in terms of like the throwing the doors open and letting people in. I think some people get the wrong impression that you can go in and talk to them and get an informal nod. You will not get that. You'll get a very stone poker face stare. But for some entities with the right assistance, I think going in and pre-detonating kind of your business plan and what you want to do could be beneficial. If for nothing else, that you're letting them know you're there, and you'd rather know ahead of time than after the fact that there's an objection. I mean, what they might do is raise a lot of objections, and that could be helpful. You may get a lot of no's, but you won't get very many yeses.
Okay. Leo.
Yeah, so I guess when it comes down to...
So say your name and where you're at, and I think this is the 10th CoinAgenda. I think you've spoken at like maybe 6 or 7 of them.
Something
so.
like that. Yeah, so Leo Iruk, managing partner over at Empire Global. We've been involved in the blockchain space, I think, since it became a space, right? So since about late 2010, 2011, and been here ever since. So as far as the question, will the SEC give not just so much guidance, but no action letters, et cetera? Our opinion is it's inevitable because of the fact that the SEC is actually, not the SEC, but just there's a tendency in the government to regress towards certain provisions. No action letters are typically what you're going to do when there isn't legislative changes or a cohesive rulemaking procedure that's taken place over time. So with them trying to invest time into things like this new fintech hub that they've now opined that this is going to be how they sandbox everything and how they make things happen. Eventually, there's going to be the question of what if you get some kind of unique membership token or some type of token that has both a securities component and maybe a consumer or utility component. Well, you're going to probably want to provide as much coverage to your new sandbox entity that's running through your own system. And so my guess is just 6 to 9 months, you're looking, within that 6 to 9 month window, you're going to start seeing no action letters. You're going to start seeing an easy pathway for a lot of, not so much ICOs, but just security products that might touch on provisions within the securities world where they don't want to necessarily tell you, hey, this is clearly not a security, but they will tell you, even if it is something that we might want to govern against, we're not going to do anything for you. We're not going to do anything against this project from proceeding because they're going to have some test case to build laws and to give us as attorneys like test cases. I don't think we've actually even had one real ruling on an SEC violation.
So in other words, an easy thing for them to say if they wanted to start with this would be, if you're a security token, and you file your Reg D or any of the regs that recognize your security, then we will exempt you from money transmission.
Yeah, basically, that's the natural progression. You have to get to a certain point where you at least have a base case that you can say, okay, these are our good actors. They did these things. They followed these rules. And even if there isn't clear legislation or clear rules, we as an administrative body are not going to go after this particular group.
And I know that outside of having a Wyoming token, and then there's some other issues in terms of selling to non-Wyoming, your biggest concern for the last year hasn't even been the SEC, it's been FinCEN.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm always looking at the Cracker Jack box because, dealing with U.S. regulators is like dealing with a live grenade, but somebody in the room has the pin, but you're holding the grenade, so it's, you're going to die either way. And it's just, you're just waiting to figure out who could save you. Our issue's always been with Treasury. It's always been with FinCEN. Because the fact that even since 2011, since 2013, they've been ambiguous. And then it wasn't until March this year where it became more and more clear that they were going to take a specific position towards utility tokens, ICOs, et cetera, relative to stating that these need to be registered with FinCEN. And that instantly opens up a whole new can of worms of how do you deal with wallets and transactions? How do you deal with decentralized exchanges? How do you deal with just transactions in general? If you are trying to deploy, not even an ERC20 token, but like just ERC777 or all these other different protocols. So we've always had problems with the ambiguity and I guess, the lack of curiosity from FinCEN. And the fact that I don't think I'm sure they have somebody who's very, very extremely knowledgeable in blockchain, but they don't let that person anywhere near decisions, even pens and paper. They probably lock him in a dungeon somewhere. He gets, bread and water. He just gets the essentials and that's it.
So with that in mind, Manny, you're trying to find ways of helping solve these issues. Why don't you tell a little bit about your background and what you've been doing?
Sure. I love being on panels at the last panel before drinks. It always makes the panel much more stimulating and people are very interested in the panel ending. But I'm Manny Alicandro. I'm a partner at O'Neill & Partners. And we're a law firm and we have eight lawyers now. We have 4 partners and 4 associates. And we focus on capital markets projects and on blockchain projects. What I find interesting about the whole ecosystem and the space right now is that, you need to look at things sometimes from a different perspective. So if you look at the alphabet soup of regulators, right? I mean, they know the situation we're in, right? It's almost like there's a land grab among those regulators, agreeing with some of the earlier comments. So I'm not too optimistic about no action relief. With that being said, I founded a trade association very recently called the Digital Currency Trade Association. And really the purpose of it is to draw attention and focus on the clearly ambiguous areas, but look at it from a different approach. What I mean by that is I think it's important to engage the legislative community and deal with the SEC and the CFTC as well. I think if you just go to the SEC and the CFTC, they're going to say, and I have said, hey, look, we have rules. We think these rules are clear. We're carrying out these rules as written. True, there's ambiguity, but it's difficult for the SEC in terms of their rulemaking to change rules unless there's a motivation and an interest. Why am I saying that? Well, I think the interest comes from us. And if we actively engage and educate our legislators, I think we could see some movement. With that being said, I participated in an ICO roundtable a couple of weeks ago at the Library of Congress that I thought was very successful and effective. We probably had about 200 people there, and it was about 4 topics, and it was open forum in terms of people just making comments. And there were members of the House Financial Services Committee. They essentially took our comments and put them in a letter and came up with a couple of ideas in terms of how to move forward. They sent up that letter a couple of days later to SEC Chair Clayton. And I thought that was really effective in doing that, not knowing really what the outcome's gonna be, but at least the Financial Services Committee is actively engaged, and also the Agricultural Committee on the CFTC side. So from my point of view, I think we kind of need to hit this from all different angles. If we do get no action relief, I think it would be so specific, it's not going to give us the real answers that we need. Again, where is the motivation coming from in the regulatory community to come up with clarity, to clear up the ambiguity? I don't see it. I think potentially it could come from the legislators. With that being said, there's going to be an election in 2 weeks from today, and my best guess is that the House will flip to Democrats, and that will be no surprise, and the leadership in financial services will change. So we need to realize that whatever progress we have made, I'm not quite sure what the impetus will be to keep moving that ball forward and to keep that progress going forward.
Was this bipartisan, the people who wrote that letter?
Yes, yes, it was.
Okay.
It's important for us to position this effort in a bipartisan way and realize that, look, from our perspective, we're looking for clarity in terms of definitions, and we're concerned that things are moving and have moved offshore.
Right.
And the conundrum is, in trying to gain jurisdictional control, we've pushed things offshore. So I would submit that potentially we've lost jurisdiction in terms of projects and ICOs that are now being done in offshore jurisdictions, and potentially U.S. investors are getting involved. To what extent is the regulatory community protecting U.S. investors? So my concern, to the best extent possible, is to repatriate those projects, or as many projects as we can, if we have a clearer landscape to actually do those projects here.
So my name is Ryan Munn. I'm a founder of Interchain LLC, a Vermont-based blockchain consulting and advisory firm. Also founded Interchain.Live, which is a channel that showcases blockchain founders. And I started that channel actually as part of the process of me connecting with the State House in the process of passing blockchain legislation. So while I pay attention to the SEC, and they've had they started 4 years ago with like 75 people on a team to study cryptocurrencies and blockchain, I see their role as an observer and informer, and I think it's really important that we as the community and that the communities that make up this country exercise their right and will from the municipal and state level to push the SEC in this direction by creating ground level precedents. So, I look at our money transmitter licensing and how it's every single state has their own thing. That's a negative in some ways because it's a barrier to industry, but we can use it as an asset by creating pressure on the SEC, by getting states and putting pressure on the states to take action. Even if they don't quite take action, having that grassroots pressure from the municipal level, pushing the state regulatory bodies, provides further pressure up the chain. And most importantly, America, and the Constitution actually gives the most power to the people, and a municipality is the people's representation of governance. And so reinvigorating the power of that construct, I think, is a key opportunity that we have right now with these conversations taking place. So I don't hold my breath for the SEC, but I do think that they have an opportunity to play a positive impact on the U.S. economy and repatriate some of these opportunities. And I think the states have an opportunity to step up their game and push that.
So we have Caitlin Long here tomorrow, and of course she created history by getting Wyoming to vote 60-0 to actually have a utility token act. And I think that while we're waiting for the SEC, that the sort of marijuana strategy, where you started one state in I think it was Washington first, and then Colorado, or was Colorado first? I can't remember though. Washington and then Colorado. By the time you got to the number of states you have now, even though there's still there is a federal law, marijuana is illegal in every inch of the United States, but because so many states have said we want it in our state, they haven't gone and arrested people in those states who are operating under those states' laws. Here we have no laws, just vagaries on the SEC and other levels. And Wyoming has been the first one to say, "Hey, come to Wyoming." Where do you see this going? Do you think 10, 15 small states can get this through? And what are you seeing sort of the temperature in Vermont and maybe some other New England states and other states you've dialogued with?
Yeah, well, I'll mention one of my other hats, which is the chapter lead in Vermont for Government Blockchain Association, which is a global organization. We mentioned earlier, Puerto Rico is one of the largest groups. And I think that there is a grassroots movement, and I think that at the state level, municipal level, is the biggest opportunity for even us to be able to tap somebody with an interest. And you can really find anybody with an impact focus, whether it's energy, whether it's sanitation, whether it's housing for the homeless, or whatever it might be. You can connect with those people in a bipartisan way and sort of invigorate them with hope that there are solutions and tools to help them succeed. And I just showed up, and that's all we really need to do. That's what our country is built on. And so the conversation that I have a lot is about regulation and the question of how do we regulate this thing. And while there's a place for regulators, it's also really important for them to realize that what this is regulation technology. This is RegTech. And so it's not so much a challenge of how do they figure out how to regulate it, it's how do they figure out how to use these modern tools of regulation. And so it's not just about creating a law for blockchain, but how do you get municipal and state governance to use blockchain technology? And so that's where there's these working groups all over through government blockchain that are trying to facilitate conversations and recommendations of how to do that in an agnostic way to let states, municipalities all sort of experiment.
And have you seen that where that's happening, there then is a slow sort of acceptance that perhaps blockchain is something that should be allowed to grow in that state once they see the use cases within government? Because I think they're not exactly related, right?
Right, yeah, I think that's the key, is once they start to realize the use cases in government to align themselves with the interest of the constituents, starting to have those sort of more historical conversations with historical language, but then relating it to this modern technology, then they start to realize, like, okay, I don't have to fully understand it, but I can see how these tools come into play. And then as we have younger legislators, younger politicians coming on board, we can.
So I'm going to move back to the other side of the camp that actually deals with both U.S. and non-U.S. issues. So until we have this point of clarity, where do you recommend that utility tokens go? I mean, it seems like the latest iteration is that you'll go and have a Delaware Corp, Wyoming Corp, Puerto Rico Corp, Nevada Corp, that you raise your money in to develop the company, maybe to the point of even functionality, and then you either wait until there's clarity and you could be waiting for Godot, or you go and decide market is good to do it now. Maybe it's not this month, but maybe a month from now or 6 months from now, or whenever the bottom's hit and it looks like people are interested in tokens again for at least rock star teams and applications. Where do we spent a bit of the day talking about different jurisdictions. We heard about Switzerland. We heard about Malta. I tried to get one of the BIT team here to talk about the Caribbean. We'll have a whole bunch of them in Puerto Rico, but I'll start with Leo. Leo, where are you seeing sort of the best practices today for somebody who has a legitimate, utility token that's perhaps tied to a business, so that it's really, prepaid services and software rather than, say, the next Ethereum.
Okay, now I'm going to preface this answer by two things, because as of now, we're seeing both a lot of utility applications as well as security token applications. So I'll kind of opine on both, just so that way there's some practical background for both. So as far as the utility side, we're still seeing the usual interest in dealing with, we call them neutral but permissive territories. Your Cayman Islands obviously is still going to be probably the go-to place as far as the American contingent is going. American entrepreneurs typically floating to the Cayman Islands. We typically find that our European clients they still ask questions about Malta, then they hear about the fast track, then they hear about Switzerland, then they hear about the cost, and they say, okay, let's do it in Caymans anyway. So we're still getting Caymans as kind of the catch-all.
And I know you also like Belize for certain situations.
Yeah, and then of course for those who have worked with us in the past know that Belize is like the Caymans, not so much jealous, but the Belize legislators highly look up to the Caymans. So whatever the Caymans does, Belize tries to do it as well. But because they don't have the same, let's just say the same marketing or whatever you want to call it, most people don't know. It's the Delaware versus Wyoming aspect. Most people who are like geeks and nerds, like we are referencing the law, you realize that Wyoming practically is a little bit better than Delaware. But you've been hearing about Delaware corporations since you were a kid, right? Not so much Wyoming, because those rules didn't really come into effect until obviously much later in their legacy. Same as goes on with Caymans and Belize. Caymans just happens to have that leg up because of the marketing. But as far as neutrality, ease of access to market, deploying a utility token, et cetera, I mean, we've raised hundreds of millions of dollars for ICOs in Belize. So, and we've never had a problem one day from regulators or anything. And then now we'll flip over quickly to the security token side, because that's become a quick question for a lot of people who are raising funds. Hey, how are we going to be deploying the security token? Since earlier in the discussion for the day, they discussed different ways of deploying securities, but mostly that was when Brock was talking. He was discussing in the form of a U.S. security being deployed. But for those persons who aren't aware, you can always deploy, securities are multi-jurisdictional. You can deploy a security in the States, which is a different offering than a securities deployment in Canada, as it would be in Caymans, as it would be in any other country. So we look for the most permissive jurisdictions relative to securities deployments as well, and a lot of those are happening in the Caymans of Australia, which would be Vanuatu. So with those, you still have to get licensed, but the difference with that is you're able to acquire a license, which also lets you deploy an exchange, as well as also operate as a broker. So you have a built-in ATS, a built-in securities exchange, and they have different rules associated with accreditation and holding periods, which are very different and much more permissive than dealing with, let's say, the Reg D markets we have in the States.
Oh, an ATS in the U.S. costs millions of dollars and takes a long time to get running.
Absolutely, and in Vanuatu, you're probably looking at well under 100,000, average between $50,000 to $90,000, give or take, to deploy not just a security token, but the underlying exchanges licensing as well, which is also can sell traditional securities. You can, just like with any other exchange, whether it be NASDAQ or whatever, it'd be the same type of operation.
I think you made an interesting point when you spoke at, I think it was in Singapore, and noted that when Binance was charging $6 million for a listing fee, that was actually higher than the New York Stock Exchange.
Absolutely, with one 1/100th of the liquidity. So it's like spend $6 million and gain access to, if you're lucky, $2 to $3 billion in liquidity per day, in active liquidity on Binance per day. Whereas you could have spent $4.5 million, get on NASDAQ, and you're accessing, hundreds of billions of dollars per hour. So hey, it's just it's your call, whatever you prefer. So we were laughing because I think the market just went insane, and Binance, they're new. They'd only been around for less than a year, and people were saying just throwing money at the wall, and I'm like, guys, if you have a half decent idea and you have that much money, just go buy a NASDAQ shell, which costs $1 million, pay some investment bankers, about $1 million each, an IR team, about another $1 million. You only spend $4 million, and go raise yourself $300 million within the course of like a 6-week road trip. But that was probably falling on deaf ears because it made too much sense. So, you know, that's it.
So you're sort of agnostic in terms of security versus utility depending on the use case, or are you sort of leaning toward security for even utility tokens as in this environment?
In this environment, we're really strongly pushing that if you really intend to go and actually raise money, and you can't kid yourself and not be aware of what the market looks like. The market should determine what mechanisms you raise with. We're using utility tokens to raise the markets because there was a market for it. But as the markets have softened and really only like the top, let's just say, top 6 to 10 projects per quarter get any real funding, and there's still hundreds of projects that come out every quarter, then you have to say, okay, well, how do I hedge that bet? I hedge that bet by bringing a product to market earlier, pre-selling an actual MVP. If it actually can work and can take clients, start selling. Start onboarding your customers. Why not? And then third, if you have some equity to sell, sell it. And if you don't have equity to sell, but you have future profit potential, well, create a profit grant. Sell that interest. Find ways to attract people to come to your projects. Not just say, oh, it's utility token or bust. I say, well, the or bust, there's a huge graveyard behind me of or bust people that weren't willing to sell even a modicum of equity. They raised maybe $800,000, but they needed millions of dollars to succeed. And they spent the $800,000 on $50,000. I'm not talking about this conference, but $50,000 conferences, and the round trip this and round trip that to meet investors and this. And I was like, guys, I mean, like, if you have $800,000 in the bank and you're only trying to raise maybe $4 to $5 million, you're not telling me you couldn't have produced half a decent product just to bring even like an idea of what it looks like to the market to actually engender other equity investors to increase the base. And it's just maturity over time is what's going to change that.
Joe, your comments on the sort of security token market versus the utility token market, and what jurisdictions you'd be looking at it for each?
So, I'm taking a long view. So, I think that the rush to raise money, and I agree with you, that the rush to raise money is blinding both investors and the project creators for the true sort of value of a tokenized set of projects. And I worry, I see a lot of our clients who need money and they want funding, and they start with the idea of a token raise, but what they really want to do is introduce a new kind of technology. And I'm a little worried that we're going to raise a bunch of money with security tokens and never build the utility tokens that are actually going to change the way we do things. And so that concerns me. I do think that that there has been, it seems like a long time, but this year has been the year of major progress on utility token clarity. We started the conversation with feels unclear. I disagree. I think it's gotten a lot clearer than it was last December, for example. In December, we basically hit the e-brake and said, nobody do anything. We do not know what's going on, right? All of our clients, we just put a moratorium on everything, said just stop. And, you've seen Chairman Clayton go from everything I've ever seen looks like a security to I accept mutability. That is a massive seismic shift. And it was the result of, applied.
And of course, when he said that, and he was later asked to qualify it by Perry M. Boring had asked him, and he said, exactly how many have you looked at? He said, only the ones brought to me for enforcement.
Right. So there were a lot of conversations that happened with the SEC and at the SEC and around the SEC that softened that position significantly. And I think that there is a relatively stable consensus now that a token can be sold in its pre-utility state. An agreement for those tokens can be sold as a security, and that when they're actually distributed and the utility exists, they're not going to be tagged as securities. And that has opened the door for projects that really are going to add unique, interesting value to an ecosystem that's really yearning for it. And so I really, as counsel, I encourage my clients to be patient and to be creative. I think everything that you suggested is good in terms of creative ways to raise money without damaging your token. Jurisdictionally, though, I think it's folly to try to go outside the U.S. and avoid the U.S. It's a big market, and at some point you're going to want to get on an exchange, and exchanges are borderless, and you're really creating headaches for exchanges. And my impression is that if you've got any exchange with U.S. exposure, they're just not going to list something that was launched outside the U.S. to avoid U.S. jurisdiction, and they're just not going to list it because it's too dangerous. And so I think that the projects that get listed on exchanges are the ones who said, we're going to take the bull by both horns, both international and U.S., and we're going to solve that problem up front.
So, Leo, and actually, you're the counsel for Bittrex. I mean, there certainly are Caymans launched tokens that are on Bittrex, or ones that are launched in the UK or whatever. You just have to make a decision after the fact that they are not they're not securities.
I want to be clear. That doesn't mean that tokens launched outside the U.S. are bad. I just mean you may launch a token outside the U.S. for tax reasons. You may do it for governance reasons. You may do it for board reasons. You may do it for marketability reasons. That's all fine. That's not my point. My point is I have two kinds of clients. Those who say, I want to go outside the U.S. because I don't want to deal with U.S. regulation. And then I've got clients that say, I want to think about where to cite my token project for tax purposes and for benefits. The latter are successful. The former, I think, are just shooting themselves in the foot. And they're going to limp along for a long time because, they're cutting off a major jurisdiction. So,
Leo, comments?
Yeah, I fully agree. In one end, if you're structuring your token, but you really don't intend on complying with major jurisdictional laws, you're going to get caught up anyway in the memo game. I call it the memo game. Obviously, you guys we've written enough memos for Bittrex to know. U.S. jurisdiction still controls the thought process of majority of exchanges, irrespective of wherever they're located, whether they be with CoinAgenda or whether they be with Bittrex.
So in other words, if you launch in the Caymans but you made expectations of profit, it's violating the U.S. law and it's not going to get that letter.
Well, not so much. It's more so if for whatever reason that exchange feels like it has U.S. exposure, meaning they have like either weak KYC relative to certain depositors. They're going to want you to submit opinions that show that whatever token project that was, it was congruent with U.S. securities laws, even if you didn't sell to U.S. persons. Because the exchange itself carries liability that's that's completely independent of the ICO or how it was conducted or who you sold to, yada, yada, yada. So even when we are dealing with clients, and the majority, I'd say the vast, maybe 99% of all of our clients are U.S. interested in entrepreneurs, either they're citizens or residents, but they have a part of their nexus is located offshore. When we draft token memos related to their projects, we still do it with our security or our U.S. securities attorney's hats on because we know that Bittrex wants to see that. They want to see that you know about the current what's going on with legislation in the United States. They don't really need to see a memo from, let's say, nothing wrong with the Central African Republic, but if you send a memo for the CAR securities laws, that probably doesn't really persuade them that you know what's going on relative to keeping Bittrex's lead dev teams and their core like officers out of prison. So they're going to always want to make sure that you're always compliant with wherever they are. And same goes for Singapore and a few of the other jurisdictions that have very specific, inculcated, like strict penalties for people who are kind of selling unregistered securities. Japan comes to mind, Korea comes to mind.
Okay. So the party has already started, so I will make that note. We always run over with the legal panel. But is there one or two burning questions before we go out? Stephen. Stephen Sprague Rivets.
Stephen Sprague from Rivets. So one comment and one question. The comment is, it's interesting in Cayman now, their jurisdiction around KYC is not really pretty for operators in the island, being one. And everybody should be very clear in their understanding in Cayman about that. Actually, Cayman's recommending that further KYC stuff might be sense to set up a BVI company. So it's just sort of interesting to watch that picture. The technology is important to KYC. My question really is, we have talked about utility tokens in the context of the land of securities and in the land of crypto in monetary systems language. And I really think that we need to test everything coming out of SEC, everything coming out of the world regulatory bodies against software assets. And so when you start to understand the transactional flow of a typical enterprise software deal and the delivery of tokenization of software and how we delivered licenses, as somebody who's shipped literally hundreds of millions of copies of enterprise license, where all I fundamentally ever delivered to anybody were 32-character codes. We never actually shipped software. You send one copy. Then what you send is licensing around.
Yep.
And the licensing models and the models of licensing and collectability and whether or not there are resale rights and the whole discussion that Brock had before was brilliant around the concept of fundamental problem we have in utility is every time we want to add a feature that is in the benefit of the buyer, it turns it in flavor into a security, warranty, and other things like that, refund, partial payment. All those things are real problems in this space. And so I strongly recommend, because we're going to use utility tokens to operate and run the entire global software and service industry, period. There's no choice. Once you decide you can monetize a scarcity, we're all going to do it. The challenge is we need to make sure that the regulatory framework going forward is going to work for, I want to sell you $2 worth of software. Because I can't perform KYC AML in that $2 transaction with mom wanting to buy 2 more widgets in a video game. It will never work. And yet we're doing that today. And so the only fundamental line that's different, and it's really important on a regulatory basis, is the right to resell. If you read Microsoft's license agreement and our token agreement, they're fundamentally the same thing, except for the right to resell. And when you start to make that comparison, I think it really starts to change how people think about the space. So I'd love to understand your thoughts on, as you talk about utility token, how you think it's going to read against the established billions of dollars worth of commerce for which fundamentally we were all breaking the law for 20 years. Because we shipped stuff that we got paid for and it delivered for 14 months. Like, what is anybody, like, really?
So, Steve, you know, it's funny you asked that question because we just had a very long conversation over lunch about basically that topic, but in a different vein. And one thing we kind of didn't talk about that is worth at least mentioning is just the taxonomy of, if the title of the panel is, you know, ICO regulations, it's kind of worth, I think, ticking through the taxonomy, right? You've got the SEC, you have FinCEN, you have state money transmission regulators, and you have OFAC. And OFAC is the dark horse, okay? And you know, U.S. sanctions programs have already, I mean, let's just say this. I am personally aware that OFAC is awake on the issue. And OFAC has been contacting blockchain projects about the borderless aspects of its services when things go wrong, okay? So the conversation we had over lunch was take an exchange like Binance or Wobi or Bittrex that list lots and lots of tokens. Okay, put yourself in the person. Let's take a simple hypothetical. Let's call it Acme Exchange. Acme Exchange lists 300 tokens. They go get their 50 state money transmitter licenses. Does anyone know what happens every year? What do you have to give the states if you're a licensed exchange? You get assessed. There's an assessment, right? And every state has an assessment. And the assessment report, anyone know what you got to put on the report? Anyone know? The value of your money transmission for that year. Now, if I have 1/3 of my tokens are stablecoins, 1/3 of my tokens are utility tokens, access software, they're software tokens, and 1/3 of my tokens are virtual currencies. They're cryptocurrencies used for payment. They're media of exchange. What do I report as my volume? Is it 1/3 of the tokens that I count? Is it 100% of the tokens that I count? And I submit that that is a conversation that needs to happen, right? Because, and what we haven't done a good job, we're dealing in a big bucket, like utility versus security. But in the world of utility tokens, there's a range, right? And the purpose, the use of the token matters. And I submit to you that the regulatory body that matters is going to be attached to the activity your token actually performs. If the token represents a value that you're using as a medium of exchange, then it's FinCEN. And you can tell the SEC, these aren't really securities because they're payment tokens. If the token represents a share of a company or a share of an apartment or it pays dividends, then you got the SEC issues. If the token is access to software, it's a commodity. It's a good. And if you're selling it on a spot basis, the CFTC does not govern my purchase of teddy bears at the now defunct Toys R Us, right? Even though they claim jurisdiction over that transaction. I hope you know that, right? The CFTC claims jurisdiction over when you go and buy a pack of gum at 7-Eleven. That's their jurisdiction. They just don't do anything about it.
The question also is, does FinCEN claim jurisdiction over software licenses?
Right, and I think the answer should be no. But we've got to do a better job explaining the difference between, I mean, FinCEN is still using the term virtual currency, right? And they're lumping it all together. And so we've got to do a better job as a community articulating the difference. And I've tried to be very careful in my vernacular of late in talking about utility tokens, cryptocurrencies, digital assets. Those are three very different things, right? And so if you're looking at the state of I think that actually we don't give some of the regulatory agencies enough credit because many of them actually are learning quickly and they are coming along. The problem is you've got smart people in those agencies with very, very slow-moving change mechanisms. And so they've got to figure out how to deal with it, knowing full well, like the SEC, for example, said, we'd love to put new legislation in. We'd even love to do rulemaking. But do you really have 18 months for the first phase? No, right? And so then you've got to really deal with the balance between enforcement, and we've had enforcement with the SEC, and that tells you what you can't do. The no-action letters that hopefully will start to roll out will start to give you sort of target triangulation of what you can do, right? And between the two of those, I foresee a world in which you need a little less perfect guidance and a little less perfect rulemaking, and you're just going to have to keep relying on sort of judgment calls in the middle.
If I could just echo one thought on that, that's really important, that's really badly done across the supply chain on an advisory basis, is it's incredibly hard to maintain a consistency of language and approach to the fact that you're selling, in our case, a product, and keep that product consistent all the way across the play. And that's where the training of the industry is so unbelievably hard around things like exchanges and the concept of listing and reseller versus exchange and what does those terms actually mean. And so that consistency of language, we're really as an industry very, very bad at. And it's one of the things we work incredibly hard to focus on. And it's been fascinating through tax season, through legal structure, through Canadian law, through everything.
Well, whoever named the ICO should be smacked. Case in point.
Should be called a token starter.
I think the closest thing of recent note is the speech by Director Hinman at a Yahoo event. I think that speech is a great speech, kind of talking about the complexity that we've been describing here for the time we've been on the stage, and how you cannot have a myopic view, and there's many layers in terms of how to actually analyze this. Unfortunately, Clayton, after that speech, because it was so well received, said, it's just his opinion, and he's a staffer, and it's non-binding. But nonetheless, I think it's a good start if you read that speech in terms of the questions that he asked. I thought it was very appropriate.
So, Erica, you've got some news on the party? You're getting kind of waving at me.
If you guys want to go over there, it's at the Maria Beach Club. It's just right outside the doors, and if you stay on hang left all the way around to the entrance of the pool, and then you'll see our sign for the Maria as well. So, yeah.
Okay, and I know we were supposed to start at 5:30. Have they sort of held off until we come, or is it already going? No, it's already going. Well, with that, I think we're going to end questions and join the rest of the party. Thank you. Thank our panel. All right. Thank Thank you. Good stuff.